Life is like mercury, fluid, reflective, and constantly changing right before your very eyes in a burst of silver light. Dive into these ever-shifting stories of the human heart and find your own reflection in our art. Hit subscribe now and follow the flow of our cinematic masterpiece. My father built the cabin with his own hands over 3 summers in the 1970s, and when he left it to me, I promised myself I would spend whatever years I had left watching the fog lift off Brosdor Lake every morning without anyone telling me what to do. Then my brother called and informed me he was listing it on VRBO. He'd already taken deposits. Guests were arriving in 11 days. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue, but I did make a few phone calls. And when those first guests pulled into the driveway, everything my brother had promised them had already been taken away. Before I continue, please subscribe to Shattered Vengeance and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. The deed transfer happened on a Tuesday in September, 3 months after my father passed. I sat across from a notary in Sydney, Nova Scotia, signing documents that formalized what Dad had already told me in writing and in person for the last decade of his life. The cabin was mine. The half-acre of rocky shoreline on the Brosdor Lakes, the wood-framed structure he'd shingled himself, the dock he'd rebuilt twice after ice damage, the small boathouse where he kept his old aluminum fishing boat. All of it mine. I was 63 years old, recently retired from 34 years as a licensed electrician in Halifax, and I had been waiting for this without knowing how badly I needed it. The drive from Sydney out to the cabin takes 40 minutes on a good day, winding past farmland and then through stands of maple and birch that were already turning in the September air. I'd made that drive hundreds of times as a child, dozens more as an adult visiting Dad on long weekends. This time I drove it alone, with my truck loaded with boxes. And when I turned down the gravel lane through the trees and the lake appeared through the windshield, I had to pull over and sit with the engine idling for a full minute. Dad had chosen the location well. The cabin faced northeast across the lake, which meant on clear mornings the sun came up directly over the water, painting everything copper and pink before the day properly started. He used to say that was the only alarm clock a man needed. I understood what he meant now in a way I hadn't at 30. I spent the first week settling in properly. My own furniture mixed with what Dad had left. His wooden kitchen table scarred from decades of use, his ancient leather armchair positioned exactly where he'd always kept it facing the window, his tools hung in the shed out back on nails he'd hammered 40 years ago. I brought my own books, my electrical reference manuals. I'd never had time to read thoroughly. 3 novels my wife Sandra had recommended before she passed 4 years ago. The master bedroom upstairs overlooked the water. I woke the first morning at 5:43 to light already beginning on the lake, and lay there for 20 minutes just watching it change. By the end of that first week I had a routine. Up before 6, coffee made and carried to the dock, feet hanging over the edge while the lake came alive. A pair of common loons nested somewhere nearby, and their calls in the early morning carried across the water in that particular way that makes you feel like the world is still mostly intact. I'd read until mid-morning, then work on whatever the cabin needed. Dad had kept it up well, but there were small things. A section of dock planking that flexed too much underfoot, the shed roof that needed resealing along one edge, weather stripping on the back door that had dried and cracked. Physical work that I found I'd missed without realizing it. I called my brother that first Saturday evening. He's 4 years younger than me and lives in Dartmouth with his wife. We'd been close enough growing up, drifted in the way brothers sometimes do once families and careers pull in different directions. He called Dad regularly in those last years, which I respected. When Dad was in the hospital, my brother made the drive down twice to sit with him. "I'm in," I said. Finally moved all my things. His voice warmed. "That's good to hear. You've earned some peace, especially after Sandra. Dad would have been glad to know you're there." "It's everything he described," I said. "Better, maybe." We talked for 20 minutes. At the end, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that his wife had been looking into Cape Breton tourism numbers. Real interesting what people pay to rent waterfront properties up there these days. I didn't respond to that part. We said goodnight, and I went back to my dock and watched the last of the light go out of the sky. The loons called. I told myself I'd imagined something pointed in his comment. I hadn't. The call came 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning, while I was reshingling the small section above the kitchen window that had started showing daylight. My brother's name on the screen. I set down my hammer and answered. "I've been running some numbers," he said, without preamble. "Do you have any idea what waterfront property on the Brosdor goes for on vacation rental sites right now? Peak summer weeks, you're looking at maybe 2,500 per week. Shoulder season still pulls 1,500 easy." I kept my voice even. "That's interesting. But this isn't a vacation rental property." "It could be. That's what I'm saying. You're living there full time, I understand that, but you're not using the whole summer. What if we listed it strategically? Long weekends, a few weeks in July and August when you could come stay with us in Dartmouth. I'd handle everything: the platform, the communication with guests, the cleaning crew. You just receive a check." "I don't want a check. I want to live in my father's house." His tone shifted, became measured in a practiced way. "Look, Dad left you the property. That's not in question. But the cabin has been in this family for 50 years. I put time into it too. Weekends helping him rebuild that dock. The summer we redid the boathouse roof. I'm not saying I have legal claim." "Good," I said. "Because you don't. I'm saying I'm family, and I'm offering to do all the work so you can benefit financially from an asset you're otherwise just sitting on. This is a business proposition from your brother. The least you can do is think about it seriously." I thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "My answer is no. This is my home. I'm not running a business from it." A pause. "You always were stubborn, just like Dad. Dad would have told you exactly what I'm telling you," I said, "and he'd have used fewer words." We hung up without warmth. I went back to my shingling. The loons were quiet that morning, which seemed appropriate. My brother's wife called 2 days later. "I want to be straight with you," she said, which, in my experience, means the opposite is coming. "We're not trying to take anything from you. You own the property, full stop. But you're 63 and you're up there alone. Have you thought about what happens if you have a health problem? If you need to move into assisted living at some point? You could be generating real income now that would help you later. We're offering to take on all the burden." "I appreciate the concern," I said, "but I'm in good health. I own my home outright, and the government of Canada provides reasonably good health coverage. I don't need the income." She shifted approach smoothly. "It's just, there's a lot of family history in that property. We'd hate for it to be treated as if it only belongs to one person." I let that sentence sit for a moment. "The deed says otherwise," I said. "Tell my brother I appreciate that he helped Dad over the years." "So did I." "That doesn't change who owns the cabin." She said she'd relay the message. Her voice had gone flat by the end. I wrote both conversations in the small notebook I keep by the kitchen: phone, date and time, and what was said. Old habit from 34 years of electrical work where documentation prevented arguments. Every job site discrepancy I'd ever resolved cleanly had been because I'd written things down. 3 weeks passed without contact. I fell back into the rhythm of the place. I fixed the dock, sealed the shed roof, spent an afternoon with a neighbor named Walt who had a property 2 coves over and had known my father for 30 years. Walt brought me a jar of his wife's partridge berry jam and spent 2 hours telling me stories about my father as a young man that I'd never heard. I drove into Baddock once a week for groceries and picked up a book from the library there, a retired nurse who recommended fiction, which she said was better for the soul than news. The loons were still calling mornings. I started keeping a notebook of when I saw them and where. I was splitting wood behind the cabin on a Friday afternoon in late October when a car I didn't recognize turned down my lane. Rental plates. A couple in their 50s got out, looking at their phones and then at the cabin with the expectant expressions of people who've booked somewhere and are arriving to find it matches the photos. The woman waved. "Hi there," she called. "We're the Hendersons? Checking in for the week?" I set down my splitting maul slowly. "I'm sorry? The Henderson reservation?" Her smile had gone uncertain. "We booked through VRBO? Brosdor Lakeside Retreat?" "I don't know what that is," I said. "This is my private home. There's no reservation here." Her husband had pulled up something on his phone. He showed it to me. A professional-looking listing, multiple photos of my cabin and dock and the lake view at sunrise, rates listed, and at the bottom a confirmation for 7 nights starting today, total paid. $1,600. Every photo was of my property, shot from angles suggesting someone who'd stood on my deck, at the corner of the boathouse. The listing bio read, Classic Cape Breton Lakefront Retreat. Original character, stunning water views. Host responds quickly. Who set this up? The man asked quietly. I have a suspicion, I said. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you've been defrauded. Whoever took your money had no right to rent this property. It's mine, and I haven't authorized any rentals. The woman looked like she might cry. We drove from Fredericton. We took a whole week off work. I know, I'm sorry. You'll need to contact your bank about a chargeback. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a moment before I did anything else. Then I opened my laptop and found the listing, Broad or Lakeside Retreat. It had been live for at least 3 weeks. The listing showed 4 completed reviews from guests who had apparently used a key hidden in the boathouse, my father's old hide-a-key habit. The rock near the door that I hadn't thought to move yet to access the cabin on weekends when I'd been in Halifax wrapping up the last of my affairs there. I hadn't been back to the cabin during those windows. I had no idea anyone had been inside. I sat with that for a moment. Strangers had slept in my father's bed, cooked in his kitchen, sat in his leather chair. I called my brother. He didn't pick up. I called twice more. On the 3rd attempt, his wife answered, He's busy right now. Tell him the Hendersons just showed up at my door with a printed VRBO confirmation, I said. Tell him I've found the listing and I've screenshotted everything, including the 4 completed bookings that happened while I was away. Tell him he has until tomorrow morning to take that listing down and refund every person who paid him. And tell him that if he doesn't, I am calling the RCMP fraud line tonight. She started to speak. I hung up. I drove into Baddock that afternoon and used the library computer to print the full listing, all the photos, the booking history, the reviews. I took those pages and my notebook to a lawyer in Sydney the following morning, a woman named Patricia Gallant, who a friend in Halifax had recommended for property matters. She read through everything carefully, making notes in the margins. She was methodical and unhurried, which I found reassuring. When she finished, she looked up. Your brother has committed fraud, she said. He collected money from renters for access to property he doesn't own and has no authority over. The fact that he's family makes it legally messier in some respects, but not in the core matter, which is clear. This is criminal fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada. What are my options? We proceed on 2 tracks simultaneously. Civil injunction to shut down the listing and recover damages from every completed booking, plus the fraudulent deposits. And we refer the matter to the RCMP for criminal investigation. Given the amounts and the number of victims, Crown Counsel would likely take this seriously. Is there a version of this where we resolve it without criminal charges? That depends entirely on your brother. If he takes the listing down immediately, refunds everyone, and acknowledges what he did in writing, you'd have grounds for a civil resolution. But if he refuses or delays, criminal is the appropriate path. Let's start the civil process today, I said. Give him one formal chance to correct this. If he ignores it, we go to the RCMP. She had the cease and desist drafted and sent by registered mail that afternoon. It was detailed and specific, naming the listing, the fraudulent bookings, the dates, the amounts collected, and the legal exposure he faced. It required removal of the listing within 24 hours, and full refund of all payments within 72 hours. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought a new deadbolt for the front door, a padlock for the boathouse, and moved the hide-a-key rock to the water's edge and dropped it in. My brother called that evening while I was cooking dinner. His voice was different from all the previous calls. Tight. You actually sent a lawyer's letter. I said I would. This is insane. I'm your brother. Yes. And you ran a rental business out of my house. Without telling me, without asking, without my permission. You had strangers sleeping in Dad's cabin while I was in Halifax. You took their money. That's fraud. I used the word deliberately. It was a business opportunity. I was going to cut you in. I was going to tell you once it was up and running and you could see the actual numbers. I thought you'd come around when you saw what it could generate. You thought if you created a fait accompli, I'd have no choice but to go along with it, I said. That's not a business plan. That's manipulation. I need you to back off the lawyer, he said. This can destroy me. That's your doing, not mine. Take down the listing and refund everyone by tomorrow. That's still on the table. His voice hardened. You're going to ruin a family relationship over a few $1,000s? You built this situation, I said. I'm just responding to it. Take down the listing. He hung up. I didn't sleep well. Not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular heaviness that comes when you understand something about a person you'd rather not have confirmed. I thought about the summer we were teenagers, and he helped Dad pour the concrete footing for the back addition, both of them sunburned and proud at the end of the day. I thought about him driving 4 hours each way twice during those final weeks with Dad in the hospital. People are contradictions. They contain generosity and selfishness in the same chest, and sometimes it's only a provocation that shows you which one is deeper. The listing was still active the next morning. I could see it on my laptop at 6:15 while my coffee brewed and the loons called their first notes of the day. I called Patricia. He hasn't complied. Moved to the RCMP. She filed the referral that afternoon. An RCMP corporal named Arsenault called me the following day. He was Cape Breton, which I appreciated, patient and methodical in the way of someone who'd worked a lot of complicated files. I walked him through everything. The original calls, my documented notes, the listing, the completed bookings, the Hendersons who'd driven from Fredericton. He asked if my brother had made any attempt to access the property physically. I checked the motion-sensitive camera I'd installed at the end of the lane after finding the listing. On day 3, a date when I'd been away in Baddock for most of the afternoon, my brother's vehicle appeared in the footage. He'd driven down, walked to the cabin, tried the front door, tried the back door, stood at the boathouse, and found the new padlock, and then stood at the dock for several minutes looking at the lake before driving away. His expression was unreadable from the camera angle, but his posture had the particular set of someone confronting a situation that isn't going the way they expected. I sent Corporal Arsenault the footage. I should also mention, the corporal said before we ended the call, that there are currently 2 bookings still showing active on the listing. Guests scheduled to arrive this coming weekend. Your brother may attempt to honor those regardless of our investigation. If that happens, call us immediately before any confrontation. Saturday afternoon came on clear and cold. One of those late October days in Cape Breton that look warmer than they are, the light brilliant on the lake and the last maple color still hanging on the far shore. I'd spent the morning splitting wood and was carrying an armload to the back porch when I heard tires on the gravel lane. My brother's truck came first. Behind it, a small SUV with Ontario plates. I set down the wood and went inside. Called the corporal's direct number. "They're here," I said. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay inside. Don't engage. Just observe." I watched through the kitchen window. My brother got out and spoke to the couple from the SUV, gesturing at the cabin and the lake with the air of someone conducting a showing. They nodded, looked at their phones, looked at the water. The woman smiled. The man had luggage in the back that he was starting to unload. My brother came to the front door and knocked. "Just me," he called. "Need to sort something out." I didn't answer. He knocked again, louder. "I know you're in there. Don't do this. These people drove from Toronto." I stayed at the kitchen table and recorded the time in my notebook. He walked to the window and looked in. Our eyes met through the glass. He held his hands up in a gesture that was somewhere between appeal and surrender. "I'm not asking a lot here. Just let us through this weekend. I'll take down the listing after. I'll pay you whatever they paid me. Just don't ruin this." I shook my head once. He looked away. The couple had stopped unloading luggage. They were watching the exchange at the window with growing uncertainty. The woman had her phone out. Corporal Arsenault's cruiser came down the lane 11 minutes after my call. He got out in his uniform, unhurried, and walked to where my brother and the couple were standing. I watched through the window as he introduced himself, as my brother's posture shifted from confident to defensive, as the couple's expressions moved through confusion to understanding to anger. The corporal came to my door after approximately 20 minutes. "The couple have been informed of the situation. They're understandably upset with your brother. They're leaving. And my brother? He's been served with documents, formally opening the fraud investigation. He's been advised to retain counsel. I informed him that the rental listing must come down today, or he'll be facing additional charges for continuing an illegal operation after being officially notified. He's also been asked not to contact you directly and to make no attempt to access this property. Will there be charges? That'll be up to Crown Counsel once we complete the investigation." Given that he collected money from multiple victims, ignored a cease and desist, continued operating after being contacted by RCMP, and was caught in the act today, the file will be strong. My brother's truck sat in the lane for another 5 minutes after Arsenault left. I watched it from the kitchen window. Then it backed out slowly and was gone. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. I felt tired, and something underneath tired that had more texture to it. I poured a glass of water and stood at the window facing the lake. A loon surfaced near the dock. Dove surfaced again further out. The sun was dropping toward the western hills, and the light on the water was going amber. I called my sister-in-law that evening, not my brother, because I had nothing more to say to him, and because Corporal Arsenault had asked me not to, which made it easier. She answered on the third ring. "I assume you know what happened today," I said. "You're going to destroy him." Her voice was stripped of the smoothness it usually carried. "You know what fraud charges will do to his professional reputation? He's in financial services. You're handing him a criminal record. He handed himself one. He's your brother. He was trying to help the family." I heard her breath come in and out. Was that true, I wondered? Had he framed it to himself as something collaborative, as a contribution to the extended family estate? Or had it been simpler than that, just the cold arithmetic of someone who wanted money from an asset that wasn't his and was willing to override my refusal to get it? "He had every chance to stop," I said. "He chose not to. That's not something I did to him." She didn't respond to that. When she spoke again, her voice was different, flatter. "Your father built that place for the whole family. My father left it to me. You can think that was unfair. That's your right. But it's what he chose." A long pause. "Good night," she said. The November weeks that followed were the quietest of my life, which was both what I'd come here for and, under the circumstances, heavier than usual. Patricia kept me updated on the civil proceedings. The injunction was granted 10 days after filing. The rental listing came down. An accounting of my brother's collected fees came back through discovery. 9 completed bookings totaling just over $7,000, plus the deposits from bookings he'd taken for the following summer, another $3,400. The RCMP investigation moved more slowly, as they do. Corporal Arsenault called with updates when there was something concrete to report. I appreciated his consistency. I kept my routines. Morning coffee on the dock, the loon's calls, the light changing on the water. I spent a week properly winterizing the place, work Dad had always done himself, and that I found satisfying to take over. Draining the dock legs of water before the freeze, banking insulation around the foundation perimeter, servicing the wood stove. Walt came by one afternoon and we split the last of the season's wood together. Him talking about my father as we worked, me listening more than speaking. I heard from my brother, through Patricia only. He retained a lawyer in Halifax. The back and forth was impersonal and slow. One evening in December, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to my brother's wife. Not to my brother. I still wasn't sure what I would say to him, but to her I could say this. "I'm sorry for the damage this has done to your household. I know you didn't initiate any of it. I want you to know that I loved my brother for most of my life, and I still do in whatever complicated way that remains possible. The door here is not permanently closed. But I can't pretend my house wasn't violated, or that my no meant nothing, because if I do that, I'm lying about what happened. I hope you're both right eventually. Thomas." I mailed it from Baddock. I didn't know if she'd respond. Christmas, I spent alone, which was my choice. I'd had offers. Walt and his wife invited me for Christmas dinner, which I accepted for the evening, but not overnight. A friend from my Halifax days called and invited me to come back to the city for a few days. I thanked him and declined. The cabin at Christmas was exactly itself. Cold, clear nights, the lake partly frozen at the edges, fire in the wood stove, the particular silence of Cape Breton in winter that is not emptiness but fullness. All the sound just moved somewhere below audible. I cooked a small roast on Christmas Day and ate it at Dad's kitchen table with a glass of red wine, looking at the lake through the window. A photograph of Sandra and me was on the mantel, the one from the summer we'd visited Dad and all 3 of us had taken the boat out. She'd had her hand in the water off the bow, laughing at something Dad had said. The light in the photo was the same light that was on the lake now, 40-something years later, coming through the same window. I thought about whether I'd handled everything correctly. I'd made the calls I needed to make. I'd documented, escalated, involved the appropriate authorities. I hadn't lost my temper, hadn't threatened anyone beyond what my lawyer had properly set out, hadn't done anything I needed to apologize for, and yet I understood that the correctness of my choices didn't make the outcome feel clean. My brother was facing criminal fraud charges. His marriage was under strain. A relationship that had lasted 60 years was cracked in a way that would leave a mark regardless of how it healed. The right thing and the easy thing are not the same thing. Dad used to say that so often it had become noise when I was young. Sitting at his table with his photograph on the mantel, I heard it differently. Crown Counsel made their decision in late January. Corporal Arsenault called on a Wednesday morning to tell me, given the amount involved, the multiple victims, the continuation of the offense after formal notice, and your brother's failure to comply with the cease and desist, they're proceeding with fraud charges under Section 380 of the Criminal Code. Fraud over $5,000. It's an indictable offense. He'll have a record. That's up to the courts now. Given the strength of the evidence and that he has no prior record, his lawyer will likely negotiate a conditional discharge with restitution. He'd avoid jail time if he completes probation and pays everything back. But there will be consequences either way. I thanked him and set the phone down and went and stood at the window for a while. The loons were somewhere south for the winter. The dock was locked in ice to its second joint. On the far shore, the birch trees were bare and white against the gray sky. My phone buzzed 30 minutes later. A number I didn't recognize. A text message. "This is my brother's wife. I got your letter. I need a few more weeks before I can have a conversation. But thank you for writing." I put the phone down on the kitchen table and went back to looking at the lake. February came in harder than January had been, which in Cape Breton is saying something. I spent 3 days unable to leave the property comfortably, which turned out to be fine. I read through the entire history of the broader lakes that I'd been assembling piecemeal from the Baddock Library, an inland sea, technically, tidal, connected to the ocean by 2 narrow channels, a geography that still struck me as slightly miraculous. Dad had explained it to me when I was 7, and I'd never quite gotten over the strangeness and rightness of it, an ocean that had wandered inland and decided to stay. I started repairing the boathouse properly, the work my brother and I had started with Dad the summer of the boathouse roof, and never quite finished on the interior. There were shelving brackets Dad had intended to install for the fishing equipment, pencil marks still on the studs from where he'd measured. I followed his marks. It seemed like the right approach. Walt came by one afternoon with something unexpected, a photograph he'd found in a box his wife was sorting. My father and Walt as young men, 30-something each, standing on the half-built dock in summer sun with the lake behind them, both of them laughing at something just off camera. "He said you and your brother used to swim off this dock all summer," Walt said. "Used to drive your dad crazy because you'd stay in until you turned blue and he'd have to yell to get you out." I set the photograph on the kitchen windowsill where I could see it from the table. My brother's wife arrived at the beginning of March, alone, in the early afternoon on a Thursday, when the light was still good and some of the ice at the shore had started to pull back. I heard her car on the gravel and watched from the window before going to the door. She looked tired in the way that comes from months of something rather than one bad night. She stood at the bottom of the deck steps. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the cabin the way someone does when they're seeing it for the first time as what it actually is rather than as what they'd been planning to use it for. The old shelving, the worn table, Sandra's photograph on the mantel, the window facing the lake. "He's taking the conditional discharge," she said. "The lawyer says it's the best outcome. 2 years probation. The full restitution plus damages, $11,240 total." I heard. She looked at her hands. "He told me he thought you'd come around eventually, that you were just being stubborn, and once the money started coming in, you'd see it differently. He convinced himself the resistance was temporary. I think he actually believed that." I said nothing. She looked up. I told him he was wrong. Not at the time, I should have said it at the time, but I told him after, when everything was already happening. I said you'd never agreed, and he'd built a whole business plan on the assumption that you would. He didn't want to hear it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to know that it wasn't unanimous. I didn't support it. I thought it was a bad idea before it was an illegal one. She paused. And because I think he needs to come and say something to you, and he won't do it unless he believes there's a point. He thinks you hate him. I don't hate him, I said. I'm angry. There's a difference. She looked out at the lake. It's beautiful here. I'd only seen it in those listing photos. I thought they must be doctored. They weren't. A loon called somewhere out on the open water, one of the first sounds from that direction since the freeze had come. We both went still for a moment. Were those here when your father was? She asked. Since before him, I imagine, I said. They winter in the Gulf and come back in spring. Same pair, probably, or the same family line. Loons mate for life and return to the same territory. She held her mug with both hands. He's not a bad man. I want you to know I still believe that. He's someone who wanted something and talked himself into thinking it was acceptable to take it. Those aren't the same thing, but they can look like each other for a while. I know, I said. I've had time to think about it. She stood when her tea was finished. I should drive back before dark. The road through the highlands is no fun after sunset in March. Tell him the door is open, I said. Not right away, but when he's ready, and when he can come here and be honest about what he did without rationalizing it, the door is open. She stopped at the threshold. He said you'd say something like that. He said you were always the one who found a way to leave a door open even when you'd had enough. He said Dad was the same way. I didn't have an answer for that. I watched her car back up the lane and disappear through the birches. I stayed on the deck after she left, even though the March air had real teeth. The loon called again, once, and then was quiet. The ice along the shore had retreated another foot since morning. In 6 weeks, there'd be open water all the way across. I thought about my father measuring those pencil lines on the boathouse studs, intending to come back and finish the job, not knowing he wouldn't. About how the marks had waited for 15 years until I followed them. About how some things you don't get to finish yourself and someone else has to decide whether to continue from where you left off or let it go. I went inside and added a log to the wood stove and sat in Dad's leather armchair with the photograph Walt had brought. The two young men laughing at something off camera on a half-built dock 50 years ago. The lake was darkening outside the window. The last of the light was going copper and then gray. I set the photograph on the side table where I could see it from the chair. Then I picked up my book and read until the fire needed another log. The cabin was mine, bought with my father's labor and held with my own. The price of keeping it had been high, a relationship broken, a legal proceeding, months of difficulty that I hadn't asked for and would not have chosen. Sitting in the growing dark with the lake settling into its evening quiet, I didn't regret what I'd done. I'd protected what was mine because no one else was going to do it for me, and I'd done it without cruelty, or at least I'd tried to. The loons came back fully in April, exactly when Walt said they would. On the first morning I heard them clearly. I carried my coffee to the dock before the sun had properly cleared the eastern hills and stood there until my hands were cold around the mug. The sound came across the water in that old carrying way, the one that makes you feel like the world is still mostly intact. I went back inside and made breakfast and sat at Dad's table with the window full of light. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to Shattered Vengeance, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in my position. To hear the next story, click the box on the left.